Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep to the principle of starting on time, and yeah, there's a few things I want to get through today, achieve today, and mainly in terms of reflections and just picking up some key ideas. So I want to do that. And what I'm going to do a fair bit of sharing of screen through PowerPoint. There's a few slides I want to work with today. Now, I'm just a bit concerned because I fixed up my screen problems from last week that was jumping all over the place. I've got a new screen, but anyway, there was a few problems yesterday when I was recording lectures, or the other day when I was recording. So I'm just hoping this is going to translate. If it doesn't, can you please let me know if things aren't coming through, because I can't tell if you can't see it. So it's just coming up now. It takes a few moments to find itself. Can you see that? Whoops. I can't see it just right now. Can you see that now? Is there a slide there?
The screen's not really centered for me.
Not centered?
Yeah, like it's missing half the screen.
Yeah, same here.
Missing half a screen. Wow.
Yeah, looks like it's zoomed in. So you're like missing parts of the word on one edge. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm. See, it's looking okay for me. I'm just trying to work out how do I deal with that? Well, I suppose another way for me to deal with it is just to work off this. How's that?
Seems good to me.
Yeah, works.
So that'll work. I mean, it's not going to be the kind of you're going to see some of the side notes and things like that, but that'll work okay, I think. Yeah. Okay, let me get that out of the way. Is that still okay? I've just expanded it a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. Well, I wanted just to highlight a couple of things. Yeah, the product, of course, I've got these neat animations going on, but anyway, we'll all of that time spent. So I want to highlight here just a few things in the news as I was picking it up on Sunday. Story from Mexico, which of course is pertinent to what we're doing this week, and particularly where we're going to focus today. Adding jobs back in August, and after losing more than 1 million jobs in the formal economy due to the coronavirus pandemic. So there's a place that's obviously experiencing difficulties like we have no idea of. This story here, I presume you're seeing something of a circling cursor there. A story that was in, and I think it's a fantastic story that's really looking up there in the Kimberley. It opens from that piece that I shared at the very outset of these workshops about the changing of names, so the Prince Leopold Ranges and the changes taking place there. And then there was another story in there about climate change, and just, we shouldn't forget about it. You should mention, environmental protection laws should mention climate change. It does seem to me that is so far off the agenda at present. We don't hear much about it. And then there was a story a few months back that I just had to highlight because I knew I wanted to start at Tuvalu. I knew I wanted to bring that place to your attention as a place removed in all sorts of ways. And I picked up this story. As the coronavirus pandemic's hitting economies around the world, the nation of Tuvalu has got an interesting little niche, producing designer coins in their own currency, but they're not sold for consumption at all on the island of Tuvalu. They're sold for the world market, and so you get the creation of these coins, and they're being made here in Perth at the Perth Mint, a company owned by the government. They're still saying. I'm surprised that hasn't been privatised. I haven't looked into it to see how much. To see what sort of level of private ownership there is. Anyway, as part of the deal, Tuvalu receives around about $200,000 a year in royalties out of this. So they're hoping to make more. They're hoping to get a greater market, not intend for circulation, really make it to Tuvalu, an agreement with the Perth Tour. And here's just an example of it. The redback spider one selling now for about $1,000 a piece. So it's got this circulation in the global market. I mean, there's all sorts of curious things in there. I mean, a nation state making money that way. But of course, this curious species that we are, the ways we love to collect stuff, fascinating. Today, the way some of us do, beware of the universalizing statement. Any sociologist would be doing that. We're not going to work on the essays today. I might find some time here and there where we stop and say, so where are we up to? But the essays are there, and you're invited to do some choosing and planning around that. There are some weekly suggestions that I'm putting forward now onto the sidebar of the Blackboard landing page. You'll be able to find that. And I just want to draw your attention to the fact that in week 9, we will have an essay writing workshop, and the tutorials will also be focused in and around the essay production. So we suspend content at that point, mainly because the main content you're going to be working and processing is going to be through the essay. So that's just to alert you to that and to start getting you thinking about, well, being ready for that to get the maximum kind of benefit. We're still about a week and a half out from, or 2 weeks it'll be out from the handing in of that essay, or the sending in of it. The thing that I mainly want to focus on today is thinking about locating agency, locating structures, thinking about the interlinks between there, which I started to raise through one of the video lectures this week. So firstly, I want to focus in on breakfast, and then I want to get out to Chiapas, where Rebecca Galemba's paper takes us to, and really want to think about locating structure, culture, relating that into agency and those Mexican borderlands that she highlights. All right. So I've made the point, excuse me, about culture-structured agency, and I've suggested to you that culture-structured agency is part of our every living moment. It's banal for the most part. It's very rare that we're going to be making life-changing decisions in any way. So it's not about drama, this. It can be, of course it can. But just be aware that for the most part, it's about the mundane, everyday practices of our lives. And practice theory is what it often gets referred to as. I mean, to call it a theory is, I think, a bit highfalutin. I don't think it really is a theory so much as an approach, a perspective might be another way of seeing this. So a practice perspective is very much focused on bringing culture, structure, agency together, as opposed to another perspective where you're far more, people can be much more structural in their approach. They see the world through the lens of structure, and it's structure that really impacts on human agency. And then there's others who see the world very much more from the more bottom up, or from the agentic point of view, from the side of view of the individual. It's individuals who make structures. That's often called the interactionist perspective. I don't want to get caught up too much in those distinctions at this stage. I'm much more interested in thinking about how we enact it. And as I've said, it's mainly banal. I remember a colleague of mine saying once at a seminar that breakfast is when serious identity work happens. And I'll never forget that statement, because I've been thinking about breakfast for quite a long time, about, you know, how did I come to make the decisions I've made through a long lifetime now, quite a few years on this planet, just and have arrived at a particular point in my morning habits. Well, how did I get there? And you know, so they were kind of questions that were coming to mind. Breakfast is where serious identity work happens. And I think that's true. And I'll explain a bit more about that. But I just wonder the extent to which you've ever thought about what you ate this morning, say, what you did or didn't eat, as the case may be. And then the impact of something like the advertising that's around. This is one of the more classic ones from Sanitarium. Spread them with butter, Vegemite or honey, and the kids just love them. Who are they targeting? And in all sorts of ways. But to what extent are we impacted by the kind of messaging around us, for example? Now, when I go to Europe, and if I happen to stay in a hotel in Europe, on the continental Europe, you get this continental breakfast, as the English tend to call it anyway. And it's always striking, I mean, if I stay with friends in Europe, always on the table in the morning are meats and cheese. And I've got to say, I always find it kind of confronting, because it's not something I associate with breakfast. It's just not. I don't look at anything. I can see a few things on this table where I do, but the other thing is about sweet food. So the availability of pastries of various sorts. If I'm in France, certainly that's very much on the table, and it's just not what I've been brought up to think of as breakfast. We think of all sorts of things. You can see the kind of order I had it in. Breakfast cereal coming out of a cardboard box in the morning. It's really fascinating to start to think about, well, how does that happen? How does that become a standard kind of practice in so many households? How did that stuff get turned into something that gets put into that kind of packaging, into cardboard boxes, and we pour it into our bowls or our empty plates, as the case may be? The full English breakfast, of course. There might have been a point in my life where I'd have relished that, but certainly not now. And it's, again, interesting to contemplate the ways in which particular messages come through around that. Croissants, yeah, well, I mean, special treats, and I've always quite enjoyed them. Here's more of a Mexican breakfast. What shall I do? What about if I can remember being given congee, rice porridge for breakfast? Fascinating to contemplate. I must admit, I've looked at 6 a few times and wondered, now what the heck was that one that I put in a couple of years back? It's dal, I believe, and I know why it's dal, because I always remember a friend of mine who was touring through India, an Austrian woman, sending me a message at some point saying, I can't eat dal for breakfast again. I just can't do it anymore. I can have it any other time of day, but not breakfast. And again, interesting questions that come up in all of this. So what I'm suggesting to you is that we can put anything through this lens, through this kind of mix, if you like, but why not try breakfast? Because I think it is one of those daily rituals for most of us, certainly not all, I obviously recognize that we can relate to and start to think about. So what I want to do now is invite you into a small group, into a discussion around this, and just see if you can pick off some of the structuring forces that are affecting you. So I've already suggested there's advertising might be one of them, but I've also been hinting at other messages that I think are there, but I don't want to preempt, and I'm interested to see where you take it to. And then the cultural elements, the things that we've been taught, the things that we've grown up to believe. As I say, when I go to Europe, I get really struck by, there's a different upbringing there. There's a different socialization that's evident in those particular key moments. So I'm just interested to see if we can tease some of that out. So let me stop that share. Culture, structure, agency, breakfast. Let me just put you into a few breakout rooms for 5 minutes. I should be able to get you into groups of 3 and 4 and just see where that takes you to. But of course, the sociological points here are to just start to think about those elements that are influencing our own individual decisions and choice making here. And I'm putting it to you as a very committed practice theorist that is part of our reality, that any kind of choices we make are always cultured, they're always structured. That's almost unavoidable. The idea of the self-made person is, to me, a sociological nonsense. But let's just focus on breakfast to start with. I'll send you into the rooms, come back in about 5 minutes. All right. So, excuse me. So it looks like we're all back. And if we have your microphones ready to unmute or unmuted, thoughts on this? What sort of things did you identify as impacting on your choices?
In our group, we were discussing that like cereal and toast is a very easy, quick, lazy thing to do. And so it's sort of the idea of like minimizing effort. Whereas then in our group, Catherine was saying that in Malaysia, people would actually go out and have a social breakfast or go to these cafes and stuff. So that's a very, very different cultural thing where, in the West, a lot of it's like, don't talk to me until I've had my coffee. Ha ha ha. We're not very social in the mornings.
Especially not work days. Huh? Okay. I mean, anybody got any thoughts, responses to that? Or your own ideas?
Further to that, this is a personal idea, but Heston Blumenthal, the big chef, actually does a continental breakfast on a train to sort of bring back the magic of breakfast, because in England, they used to sit down and have like a breakfast with their family, and now no one's got enough time. Everyone's just getting their coffee, getting on the train, and no one really pays much attention to breakfast. So I thought that was an interesting connection to what Callum was saying.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I mean, we've got to always be a bit aware of the romanticism sometimes of the past. But sure, and of course the other thing is the middle classness perhaps of those perspectives of the family sitting down for breakfast. Well, anything else to come up in the discussions around it?
One thing I notice is I find breakfast is actually quite grounded in necessity, like just what you have available at the moment.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's like a lot of my group mates, I get the kind of impression that they just use what's immediately available, which is quite similar to what I'm doing. Like, because like in Singapore, because we have a lot of cultures, so we don't really have a fixed breakfast culture. It varies greatly from culture to culture, and honestly, just if you live in a certain area and you want to eat a certain breakfast, there may not be that specific thing immediately available. So most people's breakfast is just whatever's available downstairs.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
So this, again, we're into a convenience discourse there, aren't we? A discussion of that. One part of it. Resources, of course, is another. That's got to be another element of it. I mean, one of the reasons why I have the breakfast I do, full of berries and so on, has got something to do with the kind of resources I have now compared to the resources I have when I was 25, as well as the lifestyle I was leading. Any of you discuss health messaging?
We kind of discussed like how smoothies have become like a big breakfast thing in the last few years. Because for a while everyone was having like really kind of unhealthy sugary breakfasts, and then the health messaging was sort of, oh, you shouldn't do that. But then at the same time, we live in this capitalist culture where we're not given enough time in the morning to have a healthy breakfast. So the alternative that we've been given is smoothies, because that's a really quick way of like chucking all the nutrients in one thing. And yeah.
Right. So RGL.
Yes.
So thanks, RGL. Do you care to share your name?
Sorry. Yes.
No, you don't have to do it. But so your name is
Ruth.
Ruth. Okay, Ruth. I was just wanting to respond more personally to you. So you've got a bit of a thesis going there about smoothies as a capitalist breakfast.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting one to pursue and to see if you could kind of pin it down a bit further. But of course, then that's colliding with then public health messages, which again you could argue are part of a capitalist structuring force. Our healthcare is costing too much, so we've got to find public health measures.
Yeah, and they have to keep the worker population healthy, because the thing is kind of like with stock.
Right. So I think I'm hearing in you, perhaps Ruth, a structuralist approach to this. That our agency is often, the agency can even be a bit illusory in this case. There's a lot of kind of ways in which we're being pushed into positions around it. Very, very respectable position to be taking in sociology, anthropology. Anybody else got anything they'd like to add in on this mix now?
I was just going to say, kind of in relation to that as well, how through marketing, like breakfast has become the most important meal of the day, when actually, like scientifically, that's not really backed up. So it's like this idea of like having a smoothie, make sure you get everything in the morning, like it's so important, but it's kind of just a marketing tool created by a lot of big companies.
And you're suggesting the science is at best out on that, or in fact the science might even be pointing in other directions?
I think it's definitely not the most important meal of the day. There's a lot of like, when people start looking at intermittent fasting and stuff like that, there's a lot of evidence to prove that breakfast actually isn't really that essential. Obviously it depends on your metabolism and so many factors, like how active you are, but
so individual elements of that, so the agency elements of that are part of that. This is again individual, society, and these are kind of the struggles. And of course, part of what I think we need to always keep in mind here when we're talking about society, talking about these ideas, we're always thinking statistically. So if we're talking class, if we're talking gender, if we're talking whatever kind of categorizations we use, we're always trying to talk to some extent about some sort of majority or assumptions of that, or at least a large clump of people behaving in particular ways around this. Yeah. Okay, great. Great. That's, yeah. And of course, the other thing about that is, Kira, you put that to marketing. I actually can also hear parental voices in that.
Yeah,
you know,
but
so it's something,
marketing?
Yeah, sure. But this is what I'm saying. So then you can start to see how structural forces then become part of the messaging. They get absorbed into into ideas. If your thesis is correct there, that it's coming out of that rather than parental, the parental voices are being impacted by marketing. Then, but it's very easy. It's very, I can certainly remember my parents talking about it in that way. You must have breakfast. It's very important. It's
and same for me. Like, and you can't, you have to wake up early before school, and you have to have, like, for me it was like wheat bix. So you have to have your wheat bix so you can, have a good day.
Which is busy telling us about all the good things that are in there. And then of course we're also putting iron in it for parents to feel better about these kinds of foods and those kind of things. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd also argue on that parenting front, though, that one of the reasons that breakfast is regarded as so important is because, like dinner, it's one of the 2 meals that you have control over what your kids eat. So, because once they're out the door, like they're very resourceful little critters.
Sure.
So, like, I'm absolutely convinced that my children must be half starving during school hours, because they'll often make their lunch. And if I check what they take into school, it's nowhere near enough to nourish them for a day. Given the amount of physical activity that they're
going on there. And of course, Rachel, this is fascinating too, when we start to think about how the production of perhaps anxious parents is a part of our time as well, and the kinds of responsibilities that have shifted very much onto the individual around this. So, well, in fact, it's always been there. I'm not trying to say it hasn't, but it is fascinating to contemplate, then how the parenting models and the ideas we have around that are part of cultured, structured agency as well. So yes, it becomes that whole complex of things. All right, let's move on. I think, unless there's, oh no, I shouldn't say that now. If I was going to ask for more, I should have not said let's move on first. I'll move on. And now, is the screen's being shared? Yeah. So you've got growing corn in Chiapas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you see there in the corner a Mexican breakfast served in rural farm, or traditionally served in rural farms. Hence the name Rancher's Eggs. The dish consists of fried egg over a lightly fried corn tortilla. And in Rebecca Galemba's paper that I trust many of you have read by now, and in fact, to be able to participate in the conversation we're going to open up now, we need to have some knowledge of it. She prefaces one of the sections with this lovely quote from Asturias. Sown to be eaten, it's a sacred sustenance of the men who were made of maize. Sown to make money, it means famine for the men who were made of maize. Now there's a statement of dependency. Huh? I mean, the shifts in the way, moving from subsistence farming into a market economy. Asturias's insights are interesting there. And of course, the other parts of that is sacred sustenance, the ways in which it's become such a significant part of a culture, to the point where it can become, or cultural practice and beliefs become sacred in there. So fascinating stuff. And then also Galemba picks up a quote from another researcher, King, looking at free trade agreements and their effects. And so the Union of Corn Producers in Mexico, making the point is that what's happened as a result of the free trade movement, the free trade agreement with the US, is lots of cheap corn from the US has been dumped into Mexico. Now, if we start to think about that, there's something really strange about that. And if it's probably related to the fact that the US has been subsidizing corn production in the US. So it can actually put corn into the Mexican market that's cheaper than the Mexican market. And there's the comment from the union leader. If we in Mexico do not have a comparative advantage in the production of maize, then what exactly do we have a comparative advantage in? Where do we go to from here? So the possibility of increasing impoverishment in these spaces really needs to be thought about. So what Galemba suggests is we need to critically examine neoliberalism in its ethnographic context, on the ground, as it's happening, as it's being lived, as this lived experience of these different things. So that's where we're going to very much now, is trying to just get hold of some of the lived experiences of people in different parts of the globe, to see what's going on as a consequence of so many of the different things going on around the place. And this, of course, picks up some of the stuff we were talking about last week in terms of some of the shifts that have happened in the ways in which economies and political structures have been restructured, renegotiated in different ways. Now, this is where I really wish I could drop in the animation on it, but let's just get to this then. We've got a situation of we get two groups mainly being mentioned in Galemba's paper, borderland farmers and merchants. And if we look at what she has to say in terms of how the situation, the things going on around the place have impacted, she makes the point that at first glance, this corn trade could be interpreted as a form of resistance. Now, often when people look for agency, agency equals resistance in a number of eyes. That's when you make your own decision to move against the system. That's when you're showing agency. Otherwise, you're not. It can be one of the ways in which agency is perceived. So it's some sort of free choice as opposed to forced choice. So it's a form of resistance to the liberalization of the Mexican and Guatemalan economies and the exclusion of peasants. So it could be seen that way, and it would not be unusual to see a rendering of the situation in that way. She's a practice theorist. She's taking it in a different direction. Residence practices do not necessarily contest free trade, however, and exclusionary state policies. They reconfigure relations with the neoliberal economy and the state in complex and often contradictory ways. I think the practice theorists do tend to focus much more on how people make do and get by, and would see agency in everything that we do, that even, I mean, as I would see it, that even compliance with what's going on is a form of agency. It is its own choice. Of course, it's a constrained choice, but it always is. That's part of the point that gets made through a practice focus, a practice approach to this. So what I want to do now again is just take you back into the rooms, and I want you just to tease out again. I'm assuming and hoping that at least some of you in the breakout room have had a chance to read through this paper, and start to think about particularly the structural elements impacting, bringing us to this situation here that Galemba brings to our attention. So I want you to think about the social structures in particular. I think they're easier than the cultural factors to tease out of the paper, but let's see. I've got some thoughts about that I'll share afterwards around it. But I'm really interested to see where you go, and I'm really keen for it not to be, oh, here's what I've seen in this, because you're going to see things differently. And I think it's really important that happens. And of course, I'm not structure you're thinking too much on this at this stage. So into breakout rooms is what I'm asking you to do, and now just to think about the paper in particular and the structures and the cultural factors that are at play, that are impacting the kinds of decision making, the kinds of ways in which people make do and get by. So I'll just keep them in. I'll just keep you in the same rooms. I think we're back. Okay, good. Tip for anybody, if any of you ever get involved in teaching, always, if you want to start with some complex stuff, make sure you can get start with the ideas that people can relate to. Breakfast, then move into the more complicated, more removed, more kind of abstract things, perhaps, although not very abstract if you're sitting in on those borderlands. All right, so come on, tell me, what sort of things did you identify as being some of the structural factors or cultural factors at play?
We talked about like the impact of globalization and like international subsidies and that sort of thing, as well. We looked at like the wider picture before going.
Yep. Yeah, sure. So when you say what were you talking about with the subsidies?
We kind of like briefly brought it up. We didn't go into too much, but we kind of compared it to like how the subsidies in like the US were portrayed in Black Gold, like the documentary we were supposed to watch, and how like there was a comparable effect it was having on the coffee farmers as well as the corn farmers in this paper as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So looking after the domestic markets, the rich world doing that, continuing to do that. Yep. So that's a factor. Yep. Other stuff, folks?
I was going to say in a cultural sense, how I guess they don't, corn is such a big part of their everyday lives and like their culture that they don't see it as a bad thing to kind of illegally import and export, because they feel like everyone has the right to it. So they don't compare it to, it's not on the same level as like different contraband, you know. It's just saying, you know, they have, I think there's a quote in there that's like, because we grow corn, we have the right to sell it. Like they kind of, yeah.
And the title picks that up as well, doesn't it? Of the paper itself. It's not contraband, it's corn.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. It's so ubiquitous, obviously. Yep. I was also thinking, I think it's worth picking this up, is that if also it must be that people see themselves as corn farmers. They grow corn, and they're not thinking about other forms of subsistence in that regard either. Yeah, I mean, that was also being picked up in that earlier quote. It's part of the body. It's part of who I am. Yeah. Other bits.
Would you say that it's sort of, oh, sorry, I've interrupted.
Yeah, go on. No, who did you interrupt? Were you going to say something, Katja?
Oh, no, sorry. I think I accidentally unmuted myself.
All right, that's okay. Okay. Franca?
I was just going to say that I suppose as far as social structure goes, they've been told by their government, their national government, through the use of the trade agreement, that free trade is a right, and that they should be able to trade freely, but they weren't really seeing the benefits of free trade on a local level. So they kind of just decided that if free trade is a right to all of us, then we will do it in the way that it benefits us.
Yeah, I think that Galemba is suggesting is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. They're aware of there's a kind of ironic use going on of this notion of free trade to some extent, but they're certainly borrowing that discourse and mobilizing it to good effect. Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed was like, it's sort of from a totally detached objective standpoint, it might sort of seem easy to be like, well, why don't they just stop growing corn then and grow something else? But like in the reality of it, like they've been growing corn for decades, their parents before them, maybe even their grandparents. And like with the coffee farmers in Ethiopia, you see the same thing. It isn't just so simple as, well, why don't you just do something different then if coffee isn't selling you much? You sort of need capital and training and education to like transition to a different crop type or even like field industry.
Yeah, and Callum, I think that's really a neat pickup of really the structural cultural elements at play, you know, and how just they're interweaving in all of this, you know, so the whole kind of set of practices that are there, but then on top of it becomes some of the structural problems with those kind of shifts that would be required. And I mean, there'd be a new set of training as well, you'd imagine needs to happen for other things like that. I just want to share, I'll share this slide, reminding us here of Gamelin's point about the form of agency that she sees there. So I think that some of the things that I think are worth highlighting is poverty, the ongoing realities of that in many cases. I mean, the ones who look to be making some money are the merchants, but only those who already got capital in the first place. So it's the usual story with capitalism and how that works. You know, if you want to make money, you've got to own the means of production, own the truck, and that makes such a difference. Economic liberalization has also played a big part in this, so that restructuring that happened in the 80s, 90s has played a big part in what's gone on here. Because prior to that, you're talking about a national government that guaranteed corn prices. So they guaranteed a revenue. And then that body just went, it disappeared as when the free trade agreement was struck and was enacted. So you bring in this free trade agreement and people find themselves with, well, they're not able to actually get that corn into that market. And they've also got this flooding going on at the US. And you saw all the disparaging comments about American corn, US corn, and how the heart gets ripped out of it in the cutting process. So they don't even know how to handle the stuff. So the removal of that the removal of the national body guaranteeing price of corn was a significant part of what was going on here, impoverishment going on around that. The continued ownership of land for those who are able to do that. And there must be people being displaced in there. I want to find out more about that. And in fact, I am going to interview the author very soon, and we'll be hoping to put that interview, make that available to you soon as well, just to try and get underneath this story a bit more. You've also got in the background drug cartels and the Zapatista rebellion. And the government fears that that's going to encroach into here, into this place. So they then start to tolerate this illicit trade in ways that they hadn't before, and not going to interfere with it because it's a way of just keeping the population happy enough in this setting. So we've got things like that going on. You've got and then they strike up these informal agreements with local officials. They're not prepared to sign the forms, but you get an official tolerance of the illicit trade coming out of those different needs, really. If you're a government official, you can imagine what you're trying to manage in all of that. And then comes that self-governing discourse that Franca pointed out of neoliberalism and the commitment to autonomy and free trade that comes into play there. So that's all kind of fascinating. And it just struck me as I started to process that, that this is where, to what extent are we talking here about, so the centrality of corn farming to lived experience in the cultural, more in the cultural wing of this, the history of borderland life, living on the borders, and the fact that that kind of trade's been there since those national boundaries were struck, peasant farmer mode of production, what that means for people, family life and upbringing. There's going to be a significant part of that, not brought out in the paper because we don't get that kind of micro focus there. Official tolerance of illicit trade. So what I'm also suggesting is some of these structural factors also become part of the beliefs, values, and practices of an area. So this is where you get a melding of culture and social structure. When you really start to get it together, it's hard to hold them apart. But again, as I think I made the point before, it's often helpful to do so when we're working with this. Look, I'm not going to go into the merchants. I've got the slide there, and I can make that available. The merchants have there's some different things going on with them, which are associated with having capital. So having the ability to feed into them, to be able to control the market much more than others. Because you've also got that other stuff going on about people who are outside of the borderland communities are not welcome here. So they're also controlling and making sure that they're looking after their own needs there, understandable as that is, but still it helps perpetuate and reproduce some of the impoverishment going in further into the hinterlands there of Mexico. Okay, well, I am running fast out of time, so I won't...
Can I ask you a question? On the slide here, it says tutorials preparing to debate fair trade. On module 3, it says debate the value of free trade.
Oh, look, that's a mistake on my part. I'm very sorry about that. Yes, we are debating fair trade. It's the stuff. So I'll have to have a look at that. Thanks, Callum. I had noticed I'd done some slippage, but I thought I'd not managed that. So apologies for any confusions there. Now we're going to debate fair trade tomorrow.
Sorry, just to make it clear. So like the statement that we're going to debate is fair trade is a waste of time and energy, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
The fair trade is a waste of time and energy. Yeah.
Wait, when are we debating this? Sorry.
In tutorials this week.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Okay. Yeah, not right now.
Good, because I was like, oh no.
Come prepared to argue both sides of the coin. Okay, so the quiz will open on Wednesday and closes Friday at 5 p.m. It will open early Wednesday morning. Tutorials, and you've got half an hour to do it. Tutorials, preparing to debate fair trade, start planning your essay is something, you know, so just start to get that in motion is a recommendation without wanting to sound too much like your dad. Next week's workshop, we're going to be focusing on homogenization, heterogenization, hybridity, those three key concepts that we'll be paying attention to next week. But I'm also inviting somebody from the UWA Careers Centre to come and talk about the Employability Award and just to start getting thinking about ways in which you might want to start shaping some of your university experience in the directions of careers and life beyond the university in that world of work. Okay, so that's what we'll be focusing on next week. Any other questions?
Hey, Martin, is the
Yes,
quiz,
Frankie.
does the quiz have like where you write the answers, or is it
No,
a
multiple choice. Multiple choice.
Okay.
Similar, you might even find some old friends popping up.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay, not too many of them, but they'll be there. Yeah.
Is it just covering
Yep.
everything? Is it just covering everything that we've?
Yeah, it's key concept stuff.
Okay.
The key concepts. That's really where you need to be focused there. Okay. All right. Well, look, thanks, folks. We're reaching a point now where I think productive feedback can start to being offered around the workshop. If there's anything you'd like to feedback to give me thoughts about how things are going and ways in which you could, you know, ways that things could get smoother, or maybe we can have the debate about whether or not they're a waste of time, but I certainly hope that they're adding some value. And of course, just remind you that part of what I'm trying to do here is to be able to deal with some of the content here so that the tutorials can be a bit more free to focus in more readily on certain elements. Okay, I look forward to seeing some of you in Tutes tomorrow.